Hello, my friend. Come in, sit down, relax your shoulders, and let me ask you something before we even begin. When someone asks you a simple question in English, something like, "How was your weekend?" or "What do you think about this?" what happens inside your head in that very first second? Be honest with me. Does a calm, clear sentence appear? Or does something else happen? Does a small storm start? Grammar rules flashing, vocabulary lists flipping through your memory like pages in a windy room. A voice inside saying, "Wait, is it have been or was? Is it an or a?" And by the time that storm settles down, the conversation has already moved on without you. Minnie, if that sounds familiar, I want you to know something very important right now, in these first few seconds of this video. You are not broken, you are not slow, you are not bad at English. You have simply been trained by years of classrooms, textbooks, and grammar tests to treat English as a puzzle to solve instead of a language to live in. And today, we are going to undo that training, piece by piece, together. My name is Professor William Parker, and this is the Speaking Mindset. I have spent years sitting across from students just like you, brilliant people, doctors, engineers, university students, mothers, fathers, dreamers, who can read English beautifully, who can write long essays, who understand grammar rules better than most native speakers. And yet, the moment they open their mouths to speak, something freezes. A gap appears between the brain and the tongue, and in that gap, confidence disappears. Today's lesson is not about learning new grammar. It is not about memorizing 500 new words. Today is about something deeper, something almost nobody teaches you in a normal classroom: how to stop translating, stop overthinking, and start responding in English the way you already respond in your own native language. Instantly, naturally, without fear. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why your brain freezes, and more importantly, you are going to know exactly what to do about it. I am going to give you real techniques, real exercises, and a completely new way of thinking about speaking. So get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin this journey together. This is going to be one of the most important lessons you ever watch on your path to fluent English. Chapter 1: Why your brain freezes when you speak English. Let's start right at the beginning with the moment of the freeze itself. Imagine this scene with me. You are at a party or in a meeting, or maybe just walking with a friend, and someone turns to you and says something in English, a simple question. And for 1, 2, maybe 3 long seconds, your brain goes completely silent. Then, suddenly, it becomes too loud, filled with 100 half-finished sentences, none of them ready to come out. This is what I call the freeze, and almost every single English learner in the world has experienced it, no matter their level. Here is something that might surprise you. This freeze has almost nothing to do with how much English you know. I have met students with huge vocabularies, students who could write a beautiful essay about climate change or economics, who still freeze completely in a simple conversation about their day. Meanwhile, I have met other students with a much smaller vocabulary, who speak with confidence, who make mistakes. Yes, plenty of mistakes, but who keep the conversation flowing without any fear at all. So if it is not about knowledge, what is it about? It is about the way your brain has been trained to process language. Let me explain this in a simple way. When you were a small child learning your first language, nobody taught you grammar rules before you were allowed to speak. Nobody said, before you say, "I want water," you must first understand the present simple tense, subject-verb agreement, and the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. No. You simply heard language around you, over and over, thousands and thousands of times, in real situations, with real emotions attached. And slowly, your brain built direct connections between meaning and sound. When you were thirsty, the sound water came out. There was no translation. There was no grammar checking. There was only direct expression. But when most of us learn a second language, especially as teenagers or adults, we learn it backward. We learn the grammar rules first. We learn vocabulary lists disconnected from real situations. We learn to translate from our native language into English, word by word, like solving a math equation. And this creates what I call a translation bridge in your brain, a long, slow bridge that every thought must cross before it can become a spoken sentence. You think a thought in your native language, then you carry that thought across the translation bridge, checking every grammar rule along the way, and only then does the sentence arrive at your mouth. No wonder it feels slow. No wonder it feels exhausting. You are literally doing more mental work than a native speaker every single time you speak. Now here is the good news, and I want you to really hear this. That translation bridge is not permanent. It is not a fixed part of your brain. It was built through repetition and habit, and it can be replaced through different repetition and different habits. This is what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's incredible ability to build new pathways and, over time, to make old pathways weaker while new ones become stronger and faster. Every single person watching this video, no matter your age, no matter how long you have struggled, has the biological ability to build a new, faster connection directly between meaning and English speech, without that slow translation bridge in the middle. There is also a second reason for the freeze, and this one is emotional rather than mechanical: fear. Specifically, the fear of making a mistake in front of other people. Think about your own school experience for a moment. In many classrooms around the world, when a student makes a grammar mistake while speaking, what happens? The teacher corrects them immediately, sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently. Other students might laugh, or at least the fear of being laughed at is planted deep in the learner's mind. Over years of this experience, the brain starts to associate speaking English with danger. Not physical danger, of course, but social danger. The danger of embarrassment, of judgment, of looking foolish. And here is something fascinating about how the human brain works. When it perceives danger, even social danger, it activates what we call the fight, flight, or freeze response. This is the same ancient survival system that would have helped your ancestors escape from a dangerous animal. Your brain does not fully distinguish between the danger of a wild animal and the danger of embarrassment in front of your English teacher. Both trigger a similar stress response, and one common reaction to this stress response is exactly what we are talking about: freezing. Your access to language, memory, and clear thinking becomes temporarily blocked because your nervous system believes it needs to protect you, not help you form a perfect sentence about your weekend plans. So now you understand the two main reasons behind the freeze. First, a mechanical reason, the slow translation bridge built through years of grammar-first learning. Second, an emotional reason, the fear response triggered by past experiences of correction, judgment, or embarrassment. Both of these can be changed. Both of these will be addressed directly in this video, chapter by chapter. I am not going to just tell you don't be afraid and leave you there, because that is useless advice on its own. Instead, I am going to give you specific practical tools to rebuild that bridge and calm that fear response, so that speaking English starts to feel less like solving a puzzle under pressure and more like simply being yourself in another language. Before we move to the next chapter, I want to give you a small piece of homework, something you can start today, right after this video ends. I want you to notice, without judgment, the moments when you freeze. Just notice them. Don't criticize yourself. Just become an observer of your own mind. Say to yourself quietly, "Ah, there is the freeze," almost like you are watching a familiar character appear in a movie. This simple act of noticing, without shame, is the very first step toward change, because you cannot rebuild a pathway you are not aware of. Keep this awareness with you as we move into Chapter 2, where we are going to talk directly about the translation trap and how to escape it for good. Chapter 2, the translation trap. Why translating in your head is killing your fluency. Let me tell you about a student I once worked with. I will call her Maria, though of course that is not her real name. Maria had studied English for over 10 years. She had a university degree that required advanced English reading. She could read a scientific research paper in English faster than many native English speakers. But when we sat down for a simple conversation practice, something strange happened. I would ask a question, and Maria's eyes would move slightly upward and to the side. Her lips would move silently for a moment, and then, 3 or 4 seconds later, a correct but very stiff sentence would come out. I asked her what was happening in that pause, and she told me honestly, "I am translating from Spanish in my head, checking the grammar, and then saying it." This, my friend, is the translation trap, and if you recognize yourself in Maria's story, you are absolutely not alone. In fact, I would say the majority of intermediate and even advanced English learners fall into this trap at some point, and many stay trapped in it for years without realizing there is a completely different way to speak. Let's understand exactly what happens during this translation process, step by step, because understanding the mechanism is the first step to breaking free from it. First, a thought or feeling arises in your mind, usually in your native language, because that is the language your brain defaults to for internal thinking, especially for anything emotional or personal. Second, you begin searching for the words to express that thought, but instead of searching directly in English, you search for the words in your native language first. Third, once you have the sentence formed in your native language, you begin the slow, effortful process of converting each word or phrase into its English equivalent. Fourth, while doing this conversion, you are simultaneously checking grammar rules, verb tense, subject-verb agreement, word order, prepositions, because English word order and grammar rules are often quite different from your native language. Fifth, and only after all of these steps, does the sentence finally reach your mouth. Now, count with me. That is 4 separate mental steps happening before you say a single word, and all of this needs to happen faster than the natural rhythm of conversation, because in real conversation, people do not wait patiently for 4 seconds of silence before continuing to talk. This is precisely why so many learners feel that conversations move too fast for them. It is not that native speakers are speaking unusually quickly, it is that the learner's own mental process requires more steps and more time than natural conversation allows. So, how do we escape the translation trap? The answer is not simply stop translating, because telling yourself not to do something rarely works, especially with a deeply ingrained habit. Instead, we need to build a new, more direct pathway that becomes stronger and more automatic than the translation pathway, until eventually the direct pathway becomes your brain's default choice, simply because it is faster and requires less effort. The first tool for this is something I call picture thinking, and it is remarkably effective. Instead of thinking in words at all, especially in your native language, practice thinking in pictures, feelings, and situations first. For example, instead of thinking the Spanish or Arabic or Mandarin word for hungry and then translating it, picture the actual feeling in your stomach. Picture yourself walking toward a kitchen. Picture food. Then ask your brain to produce the English word directly connected to that picture and feeling, hungry. At first, this will feel slow and strange, almost like you are creating a new habit from scratch, because you are. But with repetition, this direct connection between image, feeling, and English word becomes faster and faster, until eventually it becomes instant, exactly the way it already is in your native language. The second tool is what I call English-only zones. I want you to choose small, specific periods of your day. It could be just 10 minutes at first, where you commit to thinking only in English, even when you are alone, even when nobody is listening. Narrate your actions in English inside your own head. I am making coffee. The water is boiling. I need to find my cup. This might feel silly at first, and that is completely fine. Feeling silly is often a sign that you are stepping outside your comfort zone, which is exactly where growth happens. The goal here is not perfect grammar during this practice. The goal is building the habit of your brain generating English thoughts directly, without first passing through your native language. The third tool involves changing what you focus on while learning new vocabulary. Many textbooks teach new words through direct translation. This word means that word in your language. While this can be useful for initial understanding, I encourage you to take one extra step. After learning what a word means, spend a moment picturing the actual object, action, or feeling that word represents, without any translation at all. If you are learning the word exhausted, do not just think of the equivalent word in your language. Instead, picture a specific moment when you felt truly exhausted, maybe after a long day of work, or after not sleeping well. Connect the English word directly to that memory and feeling. This creates what psychologists call a direct semantic connection, bypassing the translation step entirely. I also want to address something important here, because I know some of you are thinking it right now. You might be wondering, but Professor Parker, sometimes I genuinely do not know the English word, so how can I avoid translating if I simply don't have the vocabulary yet? This is a completely fair question, and here is my honest answer. In the early stages of learning any language, some translation is natural and even necessary. I am not telling you that translation is evil or that you should feel guilty for doing it. What I am telling you is that translation should be a temporary bridge for new information, not a permanent habit for information you already know. If you have used a word many times before, if you have heard it, read it, and practiced it repeatedly, there is no reason your brain should still need to translate it every single time. That repeated, unnecessary translation is the habit we are breaking, not the natural process of learning something brand new. Before we move to Chapter 3, I want you to try a small experiment this week. Choose 5 simple English words that you already know well. Words like happy, tired, hungry, excited, worried. For each word, close your eyes for just 10 seconds and picture a real memory connected to that feeling, without thinking of the word in your native language at all. Just picture, feel, and then say the English word out loud. This small exercise, repeated daily, begins rewiring that direct pathway we talked about. In the next chapter, we are going to take this idea even further and talk about what it truly means to think in English and how you can train your brain to do this automatically throughout your entire day. Chapter 3, Thinking in English, Rewiring Your Brain for Instant Response. There is a phrase that gets repeated so often in the world of language learning that it has almost become a cliché. You need to think in English. Teachers say it, YouTube videos say it, language learning apps say it. But here is my honest question for you. Has anyone ever actually explained to you how to do this? Because simply being told, think in English, without any practical method, is a bit like being told, just relax during a stressful moment. It sounds nice, but it doesn't actually tell you what to do with your hands, your breath, your mind. So today, in this chapter, I am going to give you the real, practical method behind thinking in English, step by step. First, let's clarify what thinking in English actually means, because there is a common misunderstanding here. Thinking in English does not mean you need to have zero thoughts in your native language ever again. That is neither realistic nor necessary. Even highly fluent bilingual speakers, people who have spoken 2 languages since childhood, still move between languages depending on the situation, the topic, and even their mood. Thinking in English simply means that when a situation calls for English, a conversation, a meeting, watching an English video, reading an English text, your brain generates thoughts, associations, and responses directly in English, without the automatic habit of first forming the thought in your native language. The reason this matters so much for speaking specifically is simple. Speaking is thinking happening out loud, in real time. If your internal thought process happens in your native language and only gets converted to English at the very last moment before speaking, you will always experience that lag, that gap, that freeze we talked about in Chapter 1. But if your internal thought process, at least around familiar topics, already happens directly in English, then speaking simply becomes releasing thoughts that are already formed in the right language. There is no last-second conversion needed. So, how do we build this? Let me give you 5 concrete practices, and I encourage you to actually try these, not just listen and nod along. Listening alone changes nothing. Practice changes everything. The first practice is what I call narration mode. Throughout your day, especially during simple repetitive activities like cooking, cleaning, walking, or commuting, narrate what you are doing in your mind in English. I am opening the refrigerator. I am looking for something to eat. There is not much food left. I should go shopping tomorrow. This might feel unnatural at first, even a little strange, because most people do not consciously narrate their daily activities in any language. That is completely fine. The goal is not to create natural inner speech immediately, but to give your brain repeated practice generating English sentences about real, immediate, concrete situations, which is exactly the type of situation that comes up constantly in real conversations. The second practice is opinion training. Several times throughout your day, pause for just a moment and ask yourself a simple opinion question in English, then answer it in English, even silently in your head. Questions like, do I like this weather today? What do I think about this song that's playing? Would I recommend this restaurant to a friend? The reason this practice is so powerful is that a huge percentage of real conversations involve sharing opinions about movies, food, news, weather, people. By training yourself to form opinions directly in English, rather than forming them in your native language and translating later, you are directly preparing your brain for the exact kind of speaking that happens most often in real life. The third practice is future planning in English. When you think about your plans for later today, tomorrow, or this weekend, practice thinking through those plans in English rather than your native language. This afternoon, I need to finish my report. Then I will pick up my children from school. After dinner, maybe I will watch something on television. This type of practice is especially valuable because talking about plans and schedules is another extremely common conversation topic, whether at work, with friends, or with family. The fourth practice, and this one is slightly more advanced, is imagined conversation. Before you go into a real conversation, a meeting, a phone call, meeting a friend, spend just 2 or 3 minutes imagining how that conversation might go, thinking through possible questions and how you might respond, all in English, inside your head. This is not about memorizing a script, because real conversations never go exactly as planned, and trying to force a memorized script often makes speaking feel even more robotic and stressful. Instead, this practice is about warming up your English thinking muscles before you need to use them, similar to how an athlete warms up their body before a race. The fifth practice is my personal favorite, and I call it the private diary method. At the end of each day, spend just 5 minutes thinking back over your day in English as if you were writing a diary entry, but you don't actually need to write it down unless you want to. Today was a fairly good day. I woke up a little late, but I still managed to finish my work on time. In the afternoon, I had a nice conversation with my friend about our upcoming trip. This end-of-day reflection does something beautiful for your brain. It takes real, personal, emotionally meaningful content from your actual life and processes it directly in English, which creates much stronger neural connections than practicing with generic textbook sentences about fictional people you have never met. Now, I want to address a concern that I hear very often from my students. Many people tell me, Professor Parker, when I try to think in English, my thoughts feel so simple and childish compared to how I think in my native language. I feel frustrated because I cannot express complex ideas. I want you to hear this clearly. This feeling is completely normal, and it is actually a sign that you are doing the exercise correctly, not a sign of failure. Your native language thinking has had years, maybe decades, to develop complexity and nuance. Your English thinking is in a sense still young, still growing. Just like a child's thoughts become more complex and sophisticated over years of using their native language, your English thinking will naturally become more sophisticated over months and years of consistent practice. Do not compare your beginning to someone else's middle or end. Compare your English thinking today only to your English thinking 1 month ago and notice the progress, however small. I also want to mention something about mistakes during this internal thinking practice. Many learners worry about making grammar mistakes even in their private internal English thoughts, and this worry actually makes the whole process slower and more stressful. Here is my advice. Give yourself complete permission to think in broken, imperfect English. Nobody is listening to your thoughts. Nobody is grading your internal narration. The goal at this stage is speed and direct connection, not perfection. Perfection can be refined later, gradually, through more input and more practice. But if you demand perfect grammar from your very first attempts at thinking in English, you will simply recreate the same slow, effortful process we are trying to escape, just moved from external speech to internal thought. As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with one final thought. Thinking in English is not a switch you flip on one day and suddenly everything changes. It is a gradual shift, like a garden slowly growing, day by day, watered by consistent small practices like the 5 I just shared with you. Some days your English thoughts will flow more easily. Other days, especially when you are tired or stressed, your native language will take over more strongly, and that is completely normal too. Progress in this area is rarely a straight line upward. It moves up and down, but the overall direction, with consistent practice, is always toward more English, more automatically, more naturally. In our next chapter, we are going to talk about something that surprises many of my students, the incredible power of silence, and why learning to pause calmly is far more powerful than panicking when you don't immediately know what to say. Chapter 4: The Power of Silence. Why pausing is better than panicking. I want to share an observation with you that changed the way I teach speaking forever. Years ago, I was listening to a conversation between two native English speakers, just casually in a coffee shop, and I decided purely as an experiment to count the pauses. Not long, awkward silences, but the small, natural pauses that happen when someone is thinking about what to say next. And do you know what I found? Native speakers pause constantly. They say they say well, they say let me think, they take a breath, they look up for a moment while searching for the right word. Pausing is not a sign of poor English. Pausing is simply part of how human speech naturally works, in every language, for every speaker, including native speakers. And yet, in my years of teaching, I have watched countless English learners treat every single pause as a personal disaster. The moment they don't immediately know the next word, their entire body tenses up, their face shows visible stress. Sometimes they stop speaking altogether and simply say, "Sorry, my English is bad," even though, just moments before, they were speaking perfectly reasonable sentences. This reaction to silence, this panic, is often far more damaging to fluency than the actual pause itself. Let me explain why this happens, and more importantly, let me give you a completely different way to relate to those quiet moments in conversation. When you were learning English through traditional classroom methods, silence during a speaking exercise was often treated as a problem to be immediately fixed. Teachers, wanting to be helpful, would often jump in quickly to supply the missing word or correct the sentence, not giving the student time to search for the word themselves. Over years of this pattern, many learners develop a deep, almost unconscious belief: silence equals failure. Silence equals, I don't know English well enough. Silence must be filled immediately or something bad will happen. But here is the truth I want you to absorb deeply today. Silence, used correctly, is one of the most powerful tools available to you as a speaker. A short pause gives your brain the time it genuinely needs to find the right word without the added pressure of panic, making that search even harder. Think about it from a practical, almost scientific perspective. When you panic, your body releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are wonderful if you need to run from physical danger, but they are terrible for calm, clear thinking and word retrieval. Panic literally makes it biologically harder for your brain to access the vocabulary and grammar you already know. So when you panic during a pause, you are not just experiencing an uncomfortable feeling, you are actively making your own speaking performance worse. So, what should you do instead of panicking during a pause? Let me give you several practical tools that I teach all of my students, tools you can start using in your very next English conversation. The first tool is what I call the calm filler phrase. Instead of complete silence, or instead of frantic, apologetic silence, train yourself to use natural filler phrases while you think. Phrases like, "Let me think about that for a moment," "That's a good question," "How can I put this?" or simply, "Well," followed by a brief pause. These phrases do two wonderful things at once. First, they buy you a few extra seconds to find your words, exactly the way native speakers naturally do. Second, and this is important, they signal to the person you are talking with that you are actively thinking, not that you are lost or confused, which changes the entire feeling of the pause, both for you and for them. The second tool is breath awareness. When you feel a pause beginning and you notice your body starting to tense, maybe your shoulders rising, your chest tightening, your breath becoming shallow, take one slow, deliberate breath before continuing. This might sound like a small thing, unrelated to English at all, but it is actually deeply connected. That one slow breath interrupts the panic response we talked about earlier. It sends a signal to your nervous system that there is no real danger here, allowing your brain to return to a calmer, clearer state where word retrieval becomes easier again. Many of my students who adopted this simple breathing habit told me it was one of the most effective changes they made in their entire speaking journey, more effective in some cases than months of vocabulary study. The third tool is reframing what silence means to the listener. I want you to consider, honestly, how you feel when you are listening to someone else speak, in any language, and they pause for a moment to think. Do you judge them harshly? Do you think less of them? For the vast majority of people, the honest answer is no. A thoughtful pause often makes the speaker seem more genuine, more considerate, more like they are actually thinking about their answer rather than reciting something automatic. When you truly internalize this, when you believe deeply that a pause makes you seem thoughtful rather than weak, your entire relationship with silence changes. The fourth tool involves practicing pauses on purpose, which might sound strange at first, but stay with me. During your English practice sessions, whether alone or with a partner, deliberately practice pausing calmly for 2 or 3 seconds before answering a question, even if you already know the answer immediately. This trains your nervous system to associate pauses with calm confidence rather than panic, building what I call pause tolerance, similar to how someone might gradually build tolerance to cold water by starting with slightly cool water and slowly adjusting to colder temperatures over time. I also want to address a related fear that often appears alongside the fear of silence, which is the fear of losing the thread, starting a sentence, and then forgetting how you wanted to finish it. This happens to every speaker, in every language, including highly educated native speakers. The solution here is simple, but requires practice. Give yourself permission to restart. You can simply say, "Sorry, let me start that again," and begin your sentence fresh. This is not a sign of weakness. This is something confident speakers do constantly, in every language around the world, whenever their words don't come out quite right on the first attempt. Let me tell you about another student, someone I'll call Ahmed. Ahmed came to me incredibly frustrated because, in his words, "Every time there is a silence, I feel like everyone is staring at me, judging me." We worked together specifically on the tools I just shared with you: calm filler phrases, breath awareness, reframing silence, and deliberate pause practice. Within a few weeks, Ahmed told me something that stayed with me. He said, "Professor, I realized the silence was never actually the problem. My fear of the silence was the problem. Once I stopped being afraid of the pause stopped feeling so long. It's like it shrunk on its own." This is exactly the shift I want for you too. I want to leave you with one final, important idea before we move to the next chapter. There is a significant difference between what I call productive silence and panic silence. Productive silence is calm, purposeful, filled with actual thinking, often accompanied by those natural filler phrases we discussed. Panic silence is tense, anxious, often accompanied by visible physical stress, and it often leads to the speaker giving up entirely on finishing their thought. Your goal, starting today, is not to eliminate silence from your speaking, because that is neither possible nor necessary. Your goal is to transform panic silence into productive silence, one calm breath, one filler phrase, one deliberate practice session at a time. In our next chapter, we are going to build on this foundation and talk about something I call chunks, not words, a completely different way of learning and using English that will dramatically speed up your natural response time in conversations. Chapter 5. Building Automatic Response, Chunks, Not Words. I want to start this chapter with a simple question for you to think about. When a native English speaker wants to agree with someone, how many separate mental decisions do you think they make before saying, "I couldn't agree more"? If you think about it purely grammatically, that sentence actually contains a fairly complex structure, a negative modal verb, a comparative form, an unusual word order compared to many other languages. And yet, native speakers say this phrase instantly, without any hesitation at all, without consciously thinking about grammar rules in the moment. How is this possible? The answer lies in something linguists call chunking, and understanding this concept is going to completely change the way you approach learning and using English from this point forward. Native speakers and highly fluent second language speakers do not primarily think in individual words that get combined together in real time using grammar rules. Instead, they store and retrieve large chunks of language, entire phrases, expressions, and sentence patterns as single units, almost like single words, ready to be used instantly, without needing to be constructed piece by piece in the moment. Think about your own native language for a moment. When you want to say something like, "It's not a big deal," or "I'll get back to you," or whatever the equivalent expression is in your language, you do not consciously think, "Now I need a subject," followed by the correct verb conjugation, followed by an object. The entire phrase simply comes out as one smooth, automatic unit, because you have used it hundreds or thousands of times before, and your brain has stored it as a ready-made chunk, not as separate grammatical pieces that need active assembly. This is precisely what most traditional English education fails to teach effectively. Traditional grammar-focused teaching often treats language like building blocks. Here is a noun, here is a verb, here are the rules for combining them correctly. And while understanding grammar certainly has its place, especially for reading, writing, and understanding more complex structures, it is simply too slow a process to rely on for real-time spoken conversation. If you are actively constructing every sentence from individual grammar rules in the moment you speak, you will always be slower than someone who has stored common chunks and can retrieve them instantly. So, how do we build this chunk-based system in your own English, starting today? Let me walk you through the practical process. First, we need to shift what you focus on when learning new language. Instead of learning individual vocabulary words in isolation, a common but limited approach, begin focusing on learning common phrases and expressions as complete units. For example, rather than simply learning the word mind as an isolated vocabulary item, learn the complete expression, "Do you mind if I?" as a single chunk that you can use whenever you want to politely ask permission for something. Rather than learning keep and touch separately, learn let's keep in touch as one complete, ready-to-use unit. Second, prioritize learning chunks that are used extremely frequently in everyday conversation, rather than rare or overly formal expressions that you might find in advanced textbooks but rarely hear in real speech. Some examples of incredibly common, useful chunks include, "I was wondering if," "It depends on," "To be honest, as far as I know," "I'm not really sure, but," "That makes sense," "I see what you mean," "On the other hand," "At the end of the day," and "The thing is." Each of these chunks can be used in dozens, even hundreds, of different real conversations across many different topics, which makes them incredibly efficient to learn compared to memorizing single vocabulary words that might apply to only very specific, narrow situations. Third, practice these chunks through repetition in realistic contexts, not just by reading them silently. I strongly recommend saying each new chunk out loud, multiple times, ideally while imagining a real situation where you might use it. If you are learning "I was wondering if," imagine yourself actually asking a colleague, "I was wondering if you could help me with this report," and say the full sentence out loud, not just the isolated chunk. This connects the chunk directly to real, practical usage, rather than leaving it as an abstract piece of language floating disconnected in your memory. Fourth, and this is a step many learners skip, actively look for these chunks when you are listening to English, in videos, podcasts, conversations, movies, anywhere. Once you start training your ear to notice chunks rather than individual words, you will be amazed at how often the same expressions repeat themselves across completely different contexts and speakers. This is not a coincidence. Spoken English, like spoken language everywhere in the world, relies heavily on a relatively limited set of common chunks that get reused constantly, which is wonderful news for you as a learner, because it means you do not need to learn an infinite number of expressions to become a fluent, natural-sounding speaker. You need to learn the right expressions thoroughly, deeply, until they become automatic. Let me give you a practical exercise you can start immediately after watching this video. I call it chunk collection. Get a notebook, either physical or digital, and whenever you hear or read an interesting, natural-sounding English expression, write it down as a complete chunk, along with a short note about the situation where you heard it used. Do not simply write down single words. Force yourself to capture the entire phrase. Then, at least once a day, review your growing collection, saying each chunk out loud, ideally imagining a specific personal situation where you could use it. Over time, as this collection grows, you will find that many common conversation topics become significantly easier, simply because you already have ready-made chunks prepared for exactly those situations. I want to address a concern I often hear at this point in the lesson. Some students worry, if I focus on memorizing chunks, will I sound robotic or unnatural, like I'm just reciting memorized phrases? This is actually a wonderful and important question, and the answer reveals something beautiful about how chunk-based learning actually works. The goal is never to memorize a rigid script and recite it word for word regardless of context. The goal is to internalize these chunks so deeply that they become flexible, natural building blocks that you can combine and adapt in real time, exactly the way native speakers do. A native speaker who says, "I was wondering if you could help me," is not consciously reciting a memorized script either. They have simply used that pattern so many times that it flows naturally and adapts easily to whatever specific request they need to make in that moment. With enough practice, your chunks will develop the exact same natural flexibility. I also want to mention something about combining chunks with the thinking in English practices we discussed in Chapter 3. These two techniques work beautifully together. As you build your chunk collection, actively incorporate those chunks into your daily English narration, opinion training, and private diary practice. Instead of just narrating, "I am tired," practice using slightly richer chunks. "To be honest, I'm feeling pretty exhausted today." This combination of thinking in English regularly, plus building a strong foundation of common chunks, creates a powerful compounding effect where your internal English thoughts become richer and more natural, which then makes your external spoken English richer and more natural as well. Because remember, speaking is simply thinking happening out loud. Before we move to our next chapter, I want to leave you with a slightly different perspective on grammar itself, because I know some of you might be wondering where grammar fits into all of this. Grammar rules remain valuable, especially for accuracy in writing and for understanding more complex or unusual sentence structures. But for real-time spoken fluency, I want you to start thinking of grammar less as a set of rules you actively apply in the moment, and more as a pattern that gets absorbed naturally through repeated exposure to correct chunks and phrases. When you have heard and used "I was wondering if you could" enough times, you do not need to consciously remember the grammar rule about polite requests using past continuous tense for softening. The correct grammar simply comes along for the ride, embedded naturally within the chunk itself. This is exactly how children absorb the grammar of their native language without ever consciously studying grammar rules at all, and it can work remarkably well for you too, alongside, not instead of, your existing grammar knowledge. In our next chapter, we are going to explore something equally important, the emotional side of fluency, and how building genuine confidence creates what I call the confidence loop, a positive cycle that accelerates your progress far beyond what studying alone can achieve. Chapter 6, The Confidence Loop, How Speaking Without Fear Creates Fluency. I want to introduce you to a concept today that I consider one of the most important ideas in this entire video, something I call the confidence loop. Understanding this concept could genuinely change the entire trajectory of your English learning journey, so please give this chapter your full attention. Here is the core idea. Confidence and fluency are not separate things that happen one after the other, with confidence simply being a reward you receive once you finally become fluent. Instead, confidence and fluency exist in a continuous, circular relationship, each one feeding and strengthening the other, in both positive and negative directions. Let me explain both directions of this loop, because understanding the negative direction is just as important as understanding the positive one. In the negative direction, which I call the fear loop, a lack of confidence leads to hesitant, fearful speaking. This hesitant speaking often results in more noticeable mistakes, more awkward pauses, and a generally less smooth conversation experience, not because the person lacks knowledge, but because fear itself interferes with clear thinking and word retrieval, exactly as we discussed in Chapter 4. This less smooth speaking experience then confirms the person's original fear. "See, I really am bad at English." This confirmed fear then leads to even less confidence the next time they attempt to speak, which leads to even more hesitant speaking, and the cycle continues, spiraling downward, sometimes for years, even as the person's actual knowledge and vocabulary continue growing through study. This explains a phenomenon that confuses many learners and teachers alike. How can someone study English for 10 or 15 years and still feel like they cannot speak confidently? The fear loop is very often the answer. Now, let's talk about the positive direction, which I call the confidence loop, and this is where our real work begins. In this positive cycle, a person takes a small, brave action, perhaps speaking up in a conversation despite feeling nervous, or attempting to express a slightly more complex idea than they usually would. Even if this attempt is imperfect, even if there are grammar mistakes, even if there are pauses, the simple act of completing that attempt, of getting the message across even imperfectly, creates a small increase in confidence. This slightly increased confidence then makes the next speaking attempt feel slightly less frightening, which allows for slightly more relaxed, natural speech, which, as we learned in Chapter 4, actually improves the person's real speaking performance because relaxation supports clearer thinking and better word retrieval. This improved performance then further increases confidence, and the positive cycle continues, spiraling upward. The most important thing I want you to understand about these two loops is this. They are not primarily determined by your actual English knowledge level. They are determined by your relationship with mistakes, with imperfection, and with the discomfort of speaking before you feel fully ready. This means that the confidence loop is available to you right now, today, at your current level, whatever that level happens to be. You do not need to wait until you know more grammar or more vocabulary to begin building confidence. In fact, waiting for perfect knowledge before attempting confident speech often keeps people trapped in the fear loop indefinitely, because there is always more to learn, always another grammar point, always more vocabulary, and true fluency requires speaking despite incomplete knowledge, not after achieving complete knowledge, which realistically never fully arrives for any language learner, or honestly, even for native speakers who continue learning new words and expressions throughout their entire lives. So, how do we practically begin shifting from the fear loop into the confidence loop? Let me share several specific strategies with you. The first strategy involves redefining what counts as success in a speaking attempt. Many learners unconsciously define success as speaking with perfect grammar and no mistakes. With this definition, almost every speaking attempt technically fails, which constantly feeds the fear loop. I want you to adopt a different definition of success, starting today. Success means the message was communicated and understood, regardless of how many small mistakes occurred along the way. If you wanted to say you were tired after a long day, and you managed to communicate that idea, even with imperfect grammar, that is a genuine success. Celebrate it internally, rather than immediately criticizing yourself for the grammar mistakes. The second strategy involves deliberately seeking out low-stakes speaking opportunities to practice this new definition of success. This might include speaking with language exchange partners who are patient and understanding, practicing alone by recording yourself talking about your day, or even speaking to yourself in the mirror. The key word here is low stakes, situations where a mistake genuinely does not matter, where there is no real risk of serious embarrassment or negative consequences. Building confidence in low-stakes situations first, before gradually moving to higher-stakes situations like important work meetings or job interviews, follows the same principle used in almost every area of skill development, from sports to public speaking to music. You build foundational confidence in a safe environment first, and that confidence then transfers, at least partially, to more challenging situations later. The third strategy involves consciously tracking your progress over time, rather than only comparing yourself to native speakers or to some imagined perfect version of English. I recommend keeping a simple journal, even if it's just a note on your phone, where you occasionally write down small wins, a conversation that went better than expected, a word you used correctly for the first time in real speech, a moment when you didn't panic during a pause the way you used to. Over weeks and months, looking back at this collection of small wins provides powerful evidence for your brain that you are genuinely improving, which directly feeds the confidence loop, especially during difficult days when progress feels invisible. The fourth strategy is something I call mistake reframing, and it might be the most powerful tool of all. Instead of viewing a grammar mistake or an awkward pause as evidence of failure, practice viewing it as evidence of effort and growth. Every single mistake you make while genuinely attempting to communicate is actually valuable information for your brain, helping it refine and improve its English systems over time, in the same way a scientist learns from a failed experiment. Native English speakers, by the way, are overwhelmingly forgiving of grammar mistakes made by non-native speakers, especially when the message itself is clear. Most native speakers care far more about whether they understood your meaning and whether the conversation felt pleasant than about whether every verb tense was technically correct. Yuki was an incredibly hard-working student, someone who had studied grammar books cover to cover, who had an impressive vocabulary for her level. But she was trapped deeply in the fear loop, avoiding speaking opportunities whenever possible, becoming visibly anxious even during our one-on-one lessons together. We worked specifically on redefining success and celebrating small wins, exactly as I described above. About 2 months into this practice, Yuki told me something I will never forget. She said, "Professor, I used to think I needed to become fluent first, and then I would feel confident. Now I understand it was backward the whole time. I needed to build confidence first, through small brave moments, and the fluency has been following naturally, faster than I expected." This is precisely the shift I want for every single person watching this video today. As we close this chapter, I want you to remember this simple but powerful truth. Every time you speak English, despite feeling nervous, every time you finish a sentence, even with mistakes, rather than giving up halfway through, every time you allow yourself a calm pause instead of panicking, you are casting a vote for the confidence loop instead of the fear loop. And like any habit, the more votes you cast in one direction, the stronger and more automatic that pattern becomes over time. In our next chapter, we are going to explore a topic that surprises many learners: the deep, powerful connection between listening and speaking, and why the input you consume plays a much bigger role in your speaking fluency than most people realize. Chapter 7: Listening Your Way to Speaking, the Input-Output Connection. Here is a question I ask almost every new student during our first lesson together. How many hours per week do you spend actively listening to natural, real English, compared to how many hours you spend studying grammar rules and vocabulary lists? The answers I receive are often quite revealing. Many dedicated learners spend hours every week with textbooks, grammar exercises, and vocabulary apps, but only a small fraction of that time, sometimes almost none, actually listening to real, natural English being spoken by real people in real situations. Today, I want to explain why this imbalance might be holding back your speaking fluency more than almost anything else we have discussed so far in this video. There is a concept in language acquisition research, often called comprehensible input, a term developed by linguist Stephen Krashen, and though we will not go deeply into academic theory today, the core practical idea is incredibly important for you to understand. The idea is this: humans acquire language most naturally and most deeply, not primarily through consciously memorizing rules, but through large amounts of exposure to language that we can mostly understand in meaningful, engaging contexts. This is essentially how you acquired your native language as a child, through thousands and thousands of hours of listening before you ever produced complex, grammatically correct speech yourself. Now, here is the connection to speaking fluency specifically, and this is the part I really want you to understand deeply. When you listen extensively to natural English, several incredibly important things happen inside your brain, things that directly support the speaking skills we've discussed throughout this entire video. First, you naturally absorb the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation patterns of English, which then influences how naturally your own speech sounds when you produce it. Second, and this connects directly to Chapter 5, you are constantly exposed to common chunks and expressions being used in real, natural context, which reinforces and expands your chunk collection far more effectively than studying phrases from a list alone. Third, extensive listening builds what we might call pattern recognition, an intuitive sense for what sounds correct and natural in English, even when you cannot explicitly state the grammar rule behind why it sounds correct. This intuitive sense becomes incredibly valuable during real-time speaking because it allows for faster, more automatic sentence construction without needing to consciously calculate grammar rules in the moment. Let me share a comparison that I find helpful for illustrating this idea. Imagine two students both studying English for the same amount of total time per week. Student A spends nearly all of this time on grammar exercises, vocabulary memorization, and written practice, with minimal listening to natural spoken English. Student B spends a significant portion of this same time listening to natural English content, podcasts, conversations, videos, films, in addition to some grammar and vocabulary study. In my years of teaching experience, and this aligns strongly with language acquisition research, student B almost always develops noticeably better speaking fluency, more natural pronunciation, and faster real-time response ability than student A, even though both students may have technically studied the same total number of hours and even similar amounts of vocabulary and grammar content. So, how should you approach listening practice to maximize its benefit for your speaking fluency specifically? Let me share some practical guidance. First, prioritize quantity of listening, especially in the early and intermediate stages of improving your speaking fluency. This means finding ways to incorporate English listening into your regular daily routine, not just during dedicated study sessions. This could include listening to English podcasts during your commute, watching English shows or videos during your free time, or listening to English audio while doing household tasks. The goal is to significantly increase your total hours of exposure to natural spoken English, because, as we discussed, this exposure directly feeds many of the same brain systems needed for natural automatic speaking. Second, choose content that is genuinely engaging and interesting to you personally, rather than forcing yourself through boring content simply because it is labeled as educational or appropriate for your level. When content is genuinely interesting, you naturally pay closer attention, your emotional engagement increases, and research consistently shows that emotionally engaging content creates stronger, more durable memory connections compared to neutral or boring content. If you love cooking, watch English cooking videos. If you love football, listen to English football commentary and analysis. If you love true crime stories, find English true crime podcasts. Your genuine interest becomes a powerful learning accelerator, so do not underestimate the importance of choosing content you actually enjoy. Third, and this is important, do not demand 100% comprehension from your listening practice, especially at first. Remember Krashen's concept of comprehensible input. The ideal listening level is content where you understand a solid majority, perhaps 70 to 90%, allowing you to follow the general meaning and enjoy the content, while still encountering some new words and expressions in context, which is exactly how your vocabulary naturally expands over time. If you only ever listen to content you already understand completely, your growth will be limited. If you only listen to content that is far too difficult, understanding almost nothing, you will likely become frustrated and may not build the positive engagement needed for consistent long-term practice. Fourth, occasionally combine listening with active shadowing practice, a technique where you listen to a short segment of natural speech and then immediately try to repeat it out loud, mimicking not just the words, but also the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation as closely as possible. This technique directly builds the connection between input and output, between listening and speaking, in a very direct, physical way. I recommend choosing short segments, perhaps just 10 to 20 seconds long, from content you have already listened to and understood. Then practicing shadowing that same short segment multiple times until it starts to feel more natural in your own mouth. Fifth, pay special attention during your listening practice to the chunks and expressions we discussed in Chapter 5. As you listen, try to notice recurring phrases and expressions, even if you don't stop to write every single one down during casual listening. Simply noticing them, even passively, begins strengthening your recognition and eventual production of these same chunks in your own speech. I want to address a common misconception before we close this chapter. Some learners believe that listening practice and speaking practice are completely separate skills that need to be developed independently through separate types of practice. While there is certainly some truth to the idea that speaking requires its own dedicated practice, which we will discuss further in our next chapter, I want you to understand that listening and speaking are far more deeply connected than most people realize. Extensive, consistent listening practice creates the foundation, the raw material, the intuitive sense of natural English, upon which your speaking fluency is then built through additional speaking-specific practice. Neglecting listening while focusing only on speaking practice is a bit like trying to build a house without first gathering enough building materials. You might eventually get somewhere, but the process will be significantly slower and more difficult than necessary. As we move toward the final chapters of this video, I want you to start thinking about your own daily routine and honestly assessing how much natural English listening you are currently incorporating. If the answer is very little, I want to gently but firmly encourage you to change this, starting today, even if it's just adding 15 or 20 minutes of enjoyable English listening to your daily routine. This single change, maintained consistently over months, has the potential to meaningfully accelerate every other technique we have discussed throughout this entire video. In our next chapter, we are going to talk about a specific practical technique I call the 5-second rule, a simple but remarkably effective method for handling real-time conversations without falling back into the freeze we discussed at the very beginning of this video. Chapter 8, the 5-second rule for English conversations. Throughout this video, we have covered a great deal of important foundational understanding: why the freeze happens, how to escape the translation trap, how to think directly in English, why silence can be your friend rather than your enemy, how chunks accelerate automatic speech, how confidence and fluency feed each other in a continuous loop, and how listening builds the foundation for natural speaking. Now, in this chapter, I want to give you something slightly different. A simple, memorable, practical rule that ties many of these ideas together into one tool you can use in the middle of any real conversation, starting today. I call this tool the 5-second rule, and here is exactly how it works. The next time someone asks you a question in English, or the conversation reaches a point where it's your turn to respond, I want you to give yourself permission, deliberately and consciously, to take up to 5 full seconds before you begin speaking, if you need that time. During these 5 seconds, rather than panicking, rather than immediately apologizing for your English, rather than freezing in fear, I want you to follow this simple internal sequence. In the first second, take one calm, deliberate breath, exactly as we discussed in Chapter 4. This immediately begins calming your nervous system, moving you away from panic and toward the calmer state where word retrieval works much more effectively. In the second and third seconds, allow a picture or feeling of what you want to communicate to form in your mind, using the picture thinking technique we discussed in Chapter 2. Do not search for a translated sentence in your native language during this step. Simply allow the core meaning, the essential message you want to share, to become clear in your mind, even if it's not yet in complete sentence form. In the fourth second, begin reaching for a chunk or expression that fits the general shape of what you want to say, using the chunk-based approach we explored in Chapter 5. You do not need the entire sentence perfectly planned before you begin speaking. You simply need an opening chunk, a starting point, something like, "Well, I think," or "to be honest," or "that's an interesting question, let me think." In the fifth second, begin speaking, using your opening chunk, and trust that the rest of your sentence will continue to form as you speak, exactly the way it naturally does in your native language. This is a crucial point that many learners misunderstand. You do not need to have your entire sentence completely planned before you start speaking. Native speakers rarely plan entire sentences in advance either. They begin with a general direction and a starting phrase, and the rest of the sentence continues to develop and adjust as they speak in real time. Now, I want to be clear about something important. This 5-second rule is not primarily about literally counting to 5 in every single conversation, which would honestly feel quite unnatural and mechanical in real social situations. Instead, this rule exists to give you internal permission, a clear framework, for those moments when you genuinely need a bit more time to respond. Many of my students, before learning this technique, felt an intense, almost desperate pressure to respond instantly, within a fraction of a second, exactly the way they might respond in their native language. This unrealistic pressure, more than almost anything else, fuels the panic and freeze response we discussed earlier in this video. By consciously giving yourself explicit permission to use up to 5 calm seconds when needed, you remove much of that internal pressure, which, ironically and beautifully, often makes your actual response time faster, because panic itself, as we learned in Chapter 4, is one of the biggest causes of slow, blocked word retrieval in the first place. Let me give you some practical guidance on implementing this rule in real conversations. During easier, more predictable exchanges, greetings, simple questions you've answered many times before, you likely will not need the full 5 seconds at all, and that's perfectly fine. The rule is there for you as a resource during more challenging moments, not as a mandatory ritual for every single exchange. Save your conscious use of this technique for moments when you genuinely feel the beginning of that familiar freeze, that rising panic, that blank feeling. In those specific moments, consciously remind yourself, I have 5 seconds. Breathe, picture it, find a chunk, begin. I also want to address how to use this technique gracefully in real social situations, because some learners worry that pausing for several seconds might seem strange or rude to the person they're speaking with. In my experience, and in the experience of countless students who have used this technique successfully, a calm, thoughtful pause of a few seconds, especially when accompanied by natural filler phrases like, "Let me think about that," or "That's a good question," is rarely perceived negatively by the listener. In fact, as we discussed in Chapter 4, it often creates the impression of thoughtfulness rather than confusion. If you are speaking with someone who becomes impatient or judgmental over a brief, natural pause, I would gently suggest that this reflects more on their own communication patience than on any real deficiency in your English ability. I want to share one final practical tip related to this 5-second rule, something I call the graceful recovery. Sometimes, even after using the 5-second technique, you might still find yourself partway through a sentence, uncertain how to finish it, or realizing partway through that you've made a grammar mistake. In these moments, rather than stopping abruptly, becoming visibly flustered, or apologizing excessively, practice using simple, graceful recovery phrases. "What I mean is," "Let me rephrase that," "Actually, what I'm trying to say is," followed by a brief pause and a fresh attempt at your sentence. These recovery phrases, used calmly and confidently, transform a potentially awkward moment into a smooth, natural part of the conversation, exactly the way native speakers handle their own frequent mid-sentence adjustments and corrections. I encourage you to practice this 5-second rule deliberately, perhaps starting with lower stakes conversations, exactly as we discussed regarding low-stakes practice opportunities in Chapter 6. Notice how it feels to give yourself explicit permission for those calm seconds, rather than rushing anxiously to fill every silence immediately. Over time, with consistent practice, you will likely find that you need the full 5 seconds less and less often, not because the rule stops working, but because the underlying skills we've built throughout this entire video, direct English thinking, chunk-based response, calm pause tolerance, growing confidence, become increasingly automatic, exactly the goal we set out to achieve from the very beginning of this journey together. In our next chapter, we are going to move from individual techniques into building a complete, sustainable daily practice system, because understanding these ideas intellectually is valuable, but true transformation happens through consistent, real-world application over time. Chapter 9: Practicing Real Conversations, Daily Habits that Rewire Your Brain. We have now covered a remarkable amount of ground together in this video, understanding why the freeze happens, escaping the translation trap, thinking directly in English, embracing calm silence, building chunk-based automatic responses, cultivating the confidence loop, expanding your listening foundation, and using the 5-second rule during real conversations. But here is an honest truth I want to share with you, something every experienced teacher eventually learns. Understanding these ideas intellectually, even feeling genuinely inspired while watching this video right now, is not the same thing as actually transforming your speaking ability. That transformation only happens through consistent, real-world practice, applied patiently over weeks and months. So, in this chapter, I want to help you build a realistic, sustainable daily practice system that actually fits into your real, busy life. Let me first address something important about mindset before we get into specific practices. Many learners approach language practice with an all-or-nothing mentality. Either they have a full, dedicated hour available for intensive study, or they feel they shouldn't bother practicing at all that day. This mindset, while understandable, is actually one of the biggest obstacles to consistent progress. I want you to replace this all-or-nothing thinking with what I call minimum viable practice. The idea that even 5 or 10 minutes of genuine, focused practice, done consistently every single day, produces far better long-term results than occasional, sporadic, hour-long sessions that happen only when your schedule perfectly allows for them. Consistency, even in small amounts, builds and strengthens neural pathways far more effectively than inconsistent intensity. With that mindset established, let me walk you through a realistic daily practice framework, combining many of the techniques we've discussed throughout this video into a simple, sustainable routine. In the morning, even before you fully start your day, spend just 2 or 3 minutes on what I call morning English activation. This could be simply thinking through your plans for the day in English, using the future planning technique from Chapter 3, or listening to a short, energizing piece of English content, a favorite podcast segment or song, while getting ready. This small morning activation helps shift your brain into English mode early, making it easier to access English thinking throughout the rest of your day. During your commute, or during any repetitive daily activity like cooking or cleaning, incorporate the narration mode technique from Chapter 3, describing your actions and surroundings in English, or listen to engaging English content, following the guidance from Chapter 7 about choosing genuinely interesting material. This is often the easiest time to add substantial English exposure without needing to carve out separate, dedicated time from an already busy schedule. At some point during your day, ideally when you have a few minutes of genuine focus available, spend 5 to 10 minutes on active chunk collection and review, as described in Chapter 5. Add any new expressions you've encountered, and review a handful of previously collected chunks, saying them out loud with real personal example sentences. If possible, even just 2 or 3 times per week, seek out an actual speaking opportunity, whether with a language exchange partner, a tutor, a patient friend, or even simply speaking your thoughts out loud to yourself, perhaps recording yourself on your phone. During these speaking opportunities, deliberately practice the 5-second rule from Chapter 8 when you feel that familiar rising panic, and deliberately practice defining success by communication rather than perfection, as discussed in Chapter 6. In the evening, before sleep, spend just 5 minutes on the private diary reflection technique from Chapter 3, thinking back over your day in English, and if you'd like, spend 1 additional minute noting down any small wins from your English practice that day, feeding the confidence loop we discussed in Chapter 6. Now, I want to be very clear about something important. This is a suggested framework, not a rigid, mandatory schedule that you must follow perfectly every single day. Life happens. Some days will be busier than others. Some days you will forget entirely, and that is completely normal and human. What matters most is your overall consistency over time, not perfect adherence on any single day. If you miss several days in a row, please do not fall into the trap of feeling like you've failed and giving up entirely. Simply return to your practice the next opportunity you have, without excessive self-criticism, exactly as we discussed regarding mistake reframing in Chapter 6. I also want to address a common question at this point. How long will it take before I notice real improvement? This is genuinely a difficult question to answer precisely because it depends on many individual factors: your starting level, how much time you're able to dedicate, the quality and consistency of your practice, and even individual differences in how quickly different people's brains adapt to new patterns. However, based on my years of experience teaching students using approaches similar to what we've discussed in this video, many students begin noticing meaningful, encouraging changes within just 4 to 6 weeks of consistent daily practice, even if that practice is relatively modest in terms of total time. This might manifest as slightly shorter pauses during conversation, slightly less internal panic when facing a question, or simply an increased willingness to attempt speaking in situations they might have previously avoided entirely. More substantial, dramatic improvements typically continue developing over several months of consistent practice, and honestly, genuine fluency continues developing and refining itself for years, even among highly advanced speakers, which is simply the nature of language learning as an ongoing, lifelong journey rather than a destination with a fixed finish line. I want to share one more important piece of guidance regarding tracking your progress in a healthy, sustainable way. I strongly encourage you to occasionally record yourself speaking English, perhaps once every few weeks, discussing a simple topic like your recent week or your opinion on something you find interesting. Save these recordings and resist the urge to listen back immediately and judge yourself harshly. Instead, after a month or 2 has passed, listen to an older recording alongside a more recent one. This direct comparison often reveals progress that would be nearly invisible day to day, but becomes clearly evident when compared across a longer span of time, providing powerful, concrete evidence for the confidence loop we discussed earlier in this video. Finally, before we move into our final chapter together, I want to acknowledge something honestly. Building new habits, especially habits related to something as personal and identity connected as language and communication, genuinely requires effort, patience, and self-compassion. There will be difficult days, days when the old fear resurfaces, days when you feel discouraged by a conversation that didn't go as smoothly as you hoped. This is a completely normal, expected part of the process, not a sign that something has gone wrong or that these techniques aren't working for you specifically. Every single fluent speaker you have ever admired, whether they learned English as a first or second language, experienced their own version of these difficult days during their learning journey. What separates those who eventually achieve genuine, comfortable fluency from those who remain stuck is not the absence of difficult days, but the consistent choice to continue practicing, gently and patiently, even through those difficult days. In our final chapter, I want to bring everything together and talk about something deeper than technique, the new identity you are building for yourself as a natural, confident English speaker. Chapter 10. Your new identity, becoming a natural English speaker. We have arrived at our final chapter together, and I want to use this time to talk about something that goes beyond specific techniques, something deeper and in many ways more important than any single practice we've discussed throughout this entire video. I want to talk about identity and how the story you tell yourself about who you are as an English speaker profoundly shapes your actual speaking ability, sometimes even more powerfully than your actual knowledge or practice time. Let me explain what I mean by this. Many English learners, even highly capable ones, carry around an internal identity that sounds something like this. I am someone who struggles with English. I am not a natural speaker. I make too many mistakes. I will never sound as fluent as I want to. This identity, often built up over years of difficult experiences, embarrassing moments, or discouraging feedback, becomes a kind of invisible ceiling on actual performance. Even when someone with this identity gains substantial new knowledge and skill, they often unconsciously continue behaving, speaking, and hesitating in ways that match their existing identity rather than their actual improved ability, because the human mind has a powerful, well-documented tendency to behave in ways that remain consistent with its self-image, even when that self-image is outdated or simply inaccurate. This is precisely why identity shift needs to become part of your English learning journey, alongside all the practical techniques we've discussed. It is not enough to simply learn new methods, though the methods absolutely matter, as we've spent this entire video exploring in detail. You also need to consciously, deliberately begin shifting your internal identity toward that of a capable, confident, naturally developing English speaker, someone who is actively becoming more fluent through consistent practice, rather than someone permanently stuck as bad at English. So how do we practically shift this deep, often unconscious identity? Let me share some final, important guidance with you as we close this video together. First, pay close attention to the language you use when talking about your own English ability, both to others and internally, in your own private thoughts. Notice if you frequently say things like, "My English is bad," or "I can't speak well," as fixed, permanent statements about who you are. I encourage you to consciously shift this language toward growth-oriented statements. My English is improving. I am becoming more comfortable speaking. I am working on building my fluency. This might seem like a small, even superficial change, but language shapes thought far more powerfully than most people realize, and repeatedly stating fixed, negative self-beliefs genuinely reinforces those beliefs at a deep neurological level over time. Second, actively look for and acknowledge moments, however small, where you already demonstrate the qualities of a confident, capable English speaker, exactly as we discussed regarding tracking small wins in Chapter 6 and Chapter 9. Every time you successfully communicate an idea, every time you handle a pause calmly instead of panicking, every time you attempt a new expression from your chunk collection, you are providing real, concrete evidence that contradicts an outdated, limiting identity and gradually builds a new, more accurate identity as someone who is genuinely capable of natural, confident English communication. Third, I want you to consider the powerful concept of acting as if, a technique used across many fields of personal development and remarkably effective when applied to language learning specifically. This means, in appropriate situations, deliberately choosing to speak and carry yourself with the confidence of the fluent English speaker you are becoming, even before you feel that confidence has fully, naturally developed. This does not mean pretending to have knowledge you don't actually have, or refusing to acknowledge genuine areas for growth. It simply means choosing calm, confident body language, a steady tone of voice, and the willingness to speak despite imperfection, even on days when your internal confidence feels shaky. Remarkably, this outward behavior often genuinely influences internal feeling over time, gradually helping close the gap between how you currently feel and the confident identity you are actively building. Fourth, surround yourself, as much as realistically possible, with supportive influences that reinforce this new growing identity rather than reinforcing old, limiting beliefs. This might mean seeking out patient, encouraging conversation partners, following content creators and teachers like this very channel who focus on growth and genuine communication rather than harsh, perfectionist correction. It might also mean, when possible, gently limiting exposure to overly critical or discouraging feedback that focuses excessively on minor mistakes rather than genuine communication and progress. Fifth, and this is perhaps the most important point of this entire final chapter, I want you to genuinely internalize this truth. Fluency is not a fixed destination that some people naturally reach and others simply cannot. Fluency is a continuously developing skill built through consistent practice over time, available to every single person watching this video right now, regardless of your current level, your age, your past experiences, or how long you have struggled up until this point. The techniques we've explored together throughout this video, escaping the translation trap, thinking directly in English, embracing calm silence, building automatic chunks, cultivating the confidence loop, expanding your listening foundation, using the 5-second rule, and building sustainable daily habits. All of these work together, gradually, patiently, to build genuine, natural English fluency, regardless of where you're starting from today. As we close this video together, I want to leave you with one final thought, something I genuinely believe with all my heart. After years of watching students transform their relationship with English, often far more dramatically than they initially believed possible, the person you are becoming as an English speaker is not someone entirely new and separate from who you already are. It is simply a fuller, more complete expression of your existing intelligence, your existing thoughts, your existing personality, now finding a new pathway for expression through the English language. You already have interesting thoughts, genuine opinions, real stories to share, deep knowledge in areas that matter to you. English fluency is simply the bridge that allows all of this existing richness to flow more freely and naturally into your spoken communication with the wider world. I want to thank you sincerely for spending this time with me today here on The Speaking Mindset. If even one idea from this video helps you approach your next English conversation with a little more calm, a little more confidence, and a little less fear, then this video has truly served its purpose. Remember, this journey is not about achieving instant, perfect fluency overnight. It is about consistent, patient, self-compassionate practice, day after day, gradually rewiring your brain and your identity toward the natural, confident English speaker you are absolutely capable of becoming. I believe in you, genuinely and completely. Keep practicing, be patient and kind with yourself along the way, and I will see you again very soon, right here, for our next lesson together on The Speaking Mindset.